the unfortunate thing about Shopify POS is that it only uses Shop Pay.
Okay.
So here we were in this, we had a total snafu, right? So we had a system. We figured out which payment processor we could use for online, but for payment processors within the boutique, we had no idea what we were allowed to use or could use.
Growing a business requires a holistic approach that extends beyond sales and marketing. This approach needs alignment among people, processes, and technologies. So if you're a business owner, operations, or finance leader looking to learn growth strategies from your peers and competitors, you're tuned into the right podcast. Welcome to the WBS Podcast, where scalable growth using business systems is our #1 priority. Now, here is your host, Sam Gupta.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the WBS Podcast. I'm Sam Gupta, your host and principal consultant at independent ERP and digital transformation consulting firm Elevate IQ. How difficult could the payment process through a POS be? You will probably take it for granted. If you can swipe a credit card in North America, why would it be a problem in dealing with credit cards from the rest of the world? Well, when it comes to the financial processes internationally, each country has its own banking system and payment gateways. Selecting an e-commerce platform without thinking through the financial processes of that country might fire back. In today's episode, our guest, Jacquelyn Laufer, shares her insights into the Shopify POS and the challenges associated with international payments. She also shared a story about the challenges associated with Mexico localization. Finally, she shared the importance of product documentation and insights on inventory and warehousing processes inside Shopify and an omnichannel architecture. Let me introduce Jacquelyn to you. Jacquelyn Laufer is an e-commerce, digital marketing solutions, and project management consultant with over 14 years experience specializing in the luxury, fashion, beauty, and travel industries. Having launched Henry Bendel's first e-commerce website, won number 9's second, built online experiences with Estee Lauder, companies, Coty, Edit New York, and Bliss World, Jacquelyn is known for helping companies scale their business. Jacquelyn founded the e-commerce consulting and project management firm Rebuild Girl, which led the re-platforms for brands such as Leo J, Anne Klein, Joseph Wood, Creed Boutique, Flores London, Miseser Perfumes, Hanky Panky, and more. Additionally, Jacquelyn co-founded Thoughtful Web Design and Development Agency, Driver Digital with partner David Web Design and Development Agency, Driver Digital with partner David Yaski. Jacquelyn enjoys building consensus, effectively motivating and helping teams hit their mark, in defining digital solutions and integrations to help brands grow. She loves making music with her synth electronic band Real, and most importantly, hanging out with her husband and rescue dog. With that, let's get to the conversation. Hey, Jacquelyn, welcome to the show.
Hey, Sam, I'm excited to be here. How's it going?
Hey, going great. And I am super excited to have you as well because the kind of work that you are doing is fairly unique, obviously, in a very specific industry, and every industry is going to have its own nuances. So it's going to be so much fun discussing that. Just to kick things off, do you want to start with your personal story and your current focus right now?
Yeah, that sounds great. So I originally started on the agency side. I was a project manager cutting my teeth at one of those website design and development shops that were doing custom Ruby on Rails e-commerce shops back in the mid 2000s. And it was during that tenure that we just did a handful of amazing e-com projects, from Henry Bendel's very first e-commerce site to Bond Number 9's second e-commerce site. And then we worked with Estee Lauder, Coty, Edit New York. I mean, you could name a brand, we worked with them. And after 7 years of working on the agency side, I ended up going on the brand side because I wanted to see what it was like to actually work within a brand instead of an agency. So I worked at Bliss. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Bliss Spas, but they were in the Starwood hotels, and they also had an amazing brand as well. So I was their digital solutions manager for several years. And it was actually during working at Bliss that I had my light bulb moment of creating my own agency, which is my agency is called Rebuild Girl.
Very cool.
And thank you. So I was at Bliss, and my VP of ecom basically got approved a redesign and build of Bliss's site. And all of the systems that were approved to be used for the design and build had never spoken to one another. It was Acquia front end. The back end was Jagged Peaks Edge. We had a gutted integration to SysPro, the ERP. We even had an integration to Bliss's spa booking engine called Book for Time. So it was basically all of these systems that had never talked to one another before, and we had to make it work. And in conjunction, we had to get design approved, from a front end perspective. So you can imagine what a kerfuffle this project was. So it was during that project that I had my aha moment where I was like, you know what? Brands need assistance. They need an outside consultant to help work with them to do the due diligence on the systems that exist out there, figure out what's right for their business from a budgetary standpoint and an operational standpoint. And then they need someone to work with them on a day-to-day basis to help see this project through to fruition. Because as we all very well know, if you're going through a migration, it's basically like doing a second or even third job. So having that added support while you're keeping the day-to-day operations going is so key. And so that was really the premise and the spark that came into play when I created Rebuild Girl.
Very cool. I could not agree more. I mean, I personally have always underestimated the work that is typically required in executing these projects. And obviously, when you are going to have multiple systems, it's always extremely tricky. You just don't know what you don't know. And that is always the biggest challenge with these projects. Now, as you know, Jacquelyn, obviously we are going to be digging deeper into all of this. My audience is going to be slightly traditional. I mean, they are not as cool as the fashion world. We are the manufacturing executives, They don't understand as much, web world or the technology world. And when you say things like Ruby on Rails, for developer community, that's a woo-hoo. But for manufacturing, they are like, okay, is that some sort of ingredient that goes in my manufactured product? What are we talking about here? Okay, so obviously our audience is going to be the financial executives. So if we can break it down a little bit for them, obviously that's going to be super helpful. So we'll have a lot of fun discussing all of that. Okay, but before we do that, we have one of these standard questions that we ask every single guest, and that is going to be your perspective on business growth.
It is all about the quality of your product. That is the key, in my opinion, because you can market it all the live long day. You can make a beautiful website. You can throw hundreds of thousands of dollars at it from a marketing perspective. But if your product stinks, then it's just not going to work. More and more consumers are very much caring about the story of the brand. Where was it made? Is sustainability involved? What's the story of the owners that created it? So I feel like that getting that story straight and getting the product straight is really where you're going to set yourself up for success to have that growth. So.
Yeah, amazing perspective. And I am going to say one thing about manufacturing. Obviously, we have had a lot of different episodes about manufacturing. And one thing they are always challenged with is going to be in narrating their story and narrating their story in the digital form, because your customer experience, in my mind, is probably part of your story as well. And you need to enable that, using different systems. So we are going to be discussing all of that. So I'm actually going to start with the first question, because the kind of work that you do even though you are talking about the marketing branding story, but your work is very deeply involved when we talk about things like payment and Mexico localization. That's
Sure.
a very, very, very hard lift overall from the operations perspective, right? So
Yeah.
let's say if I am the financial executive and I may have an entity in Mexico, I may be doing business in Mexico, and I have no idea what is really involved in sort of enabling the seamless transaction that I need to do with the Mexico entity. I need to conduct the business. I may have, web portal there. I may be serving Mexico market. So let's say if somebody is starting on this journey, what are the things they might expect when they are trying to create either their digital strategy or the brand strategy?
Absolutely. So, uh, opening a business in Mexico, I felt like I became MacGyver and I had to be a detective to figure out
Yep.
how all of this worked because it is not a well talked about, well documented area in relation to both e-commerce and also setting up brick and mortar, truthfully. So,
Yep.
I had the opportunity to work with forgive me, it's another beauty brand. They obviously have a US location for e-commerce and also boutiques here, but they were launching in Mexico, both a Mexico site and also a Mexico boutique. And I'm going to talk about platforms a little bit just
Yeah.
because it will lead us to some of the answers that you're asking for. So we're using Shopify
Okay.
for the e-commerce.
Okay.
And basically Shop Pay, which is basically the payment processor for Shopify,
Okay.
actually does not service Mexico.
Okay.
So that was a huge deterrent for us because here we are, we want to use the same platform across multiple countries, but
Yeah.
the payment processing option was not available. So we discovered that we needed to use, there's several different payment processors that service Mexico from an online perspective. Some of those, just to talk that through. So for any of your listeners that might be going through this process, Stripe services Mexico.
Yeah.
Forgive me. Mercado Pago is another that services Mexico.
Yeah.
And also PayPal Zettle is another that services Mexico.
Okay.
So those are a couple of payment processors that people could look at from an e-com standpoint.
Yeah.
But here's the other clincher. So let's say you want to have an e-commerce website, but also have a brick and mortar store, and you want to use the same system, obviously. So Shopify has Shopify POS.
Yeah.
So the unfortunate thing about Shopify POS is that it only uses Shop Pay.
Okay.
So here we were in this, we had a total snafu, right? So we had a system. We figured out which payment processor we could use for online, but for payment processors within the boutique, we had no idea what we were allowed to use or could use. So we went through a long series of weeks of research to discover what we could actually do. And basically, Mercado Pago has terminals, but getting into contact with someone at Mercado Pago is a very difficult process. You have to work in back channels to finally speak to someone. So we didn't go that route at launch. We also looked at Stripe because naturally we thought Stripe would be the payment processor. However, they didn't have terminals to be able to run credit card processing. So Stripe was not another option. So we also looked at PayPal Zettle. So PayPal Zettle is actually a very interesting option because you can use them for e-commerce processing, but then they also have terminals, which are becoming very widely used in Mexico from all of my research. So that was kind of we were heading in the direction of using PayPal Zettle. But then we learned, and this was like the biggest reveal to us of all, that most brick and mortar stores in Mexico are working with their banks, their respective banks, and the banks are providing the credit card terminals. So the most popular banks in Mexico right now are BBVA. I'm sure you've heard of. There's also Citibanamex, so that's part of Citibank, and then Santander. So they actually are the people that supply the terminals, and then you can run the credit card transactions within your store. To tie it all back to Shopify, there's, obviously there's a custom payment option that you can enter into Shopify. So that way it's noting your transaction. The other thing I would like to say too is that we learned is that in some cases, if you're working with the banks and using their terminals, sometimes you have a separate terminal for Visa, MasterCard and a separate terminal for Amex. So as you can imagine, your sales representatives are walking around the store with like tons of pieces of gear. So
I would love to have 15.
Exactly.
Right in front of the customer, right?
Exactly. It's so wild. So it's a very interesting business in Mexico. And it's just a wonder, it's such a growing area too. So there's a lot of opportunity there. And I feel like once I went through this process, I felt like a very strong need to like get out there in the world and start talking about it because like it shouldn't be this complicated, right? So I hope that helps.
Yeah, very cool. It does help. Thank you so much. So obviously, when companies are looking for this, I mean, for them, even if they might be starting any sort of system journey or e-commerce journey, I can almost guarantee that they are probably not worrying about the details. And especially at the leadership level, they are like, okay, I am looking for this system. This should work automatically. You guys can figure it out. You guys are technical people, but obviously this is going to be a lot more related to the business model, what you are trying to do. And sometimes that may require the process change as well. In this particular case, maybe you figured out, which payment option is going to work, but sometimes you might actually need to change your business a little bit to accommodate whatever options may be available for you. So the clarifying question, obviously, there are a lot of layers and we can take this conversation in many different directions.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I'm going to touch on this is going to be one of the points that you mentioned is not well documented, not well talked about. Now, people who don't, implement e-commerce or ERP system for living, they don't necessarily understand the importance of documentation from their perspective as well as from our perspective. Because as the mechanic, if I'm trying to repair my truck, I need the documentation about the truck. Otherwise, I'll not be able to repair that. So talk to us about why well documented and well talked about is important when it comes to any sort of digital journey.
Absolutely. So I by no means mean to dog on Shopify in any way, shape, or form. They're a partner of both of my agencies, and it is my preferred e-commerce platform that I like to work within. However, I am absolutely shocked that we were not given the proper insight on the onset that Shopify was aware that we were using the e-commerce platform and we had POS, and to have someone describe to us from a documentation standpoint, like, look, these are the paths that you should use. I mean, obviously they give you a couple of lists of payment processors that you can use, but they don't go into the intricacies of, well, POS for payment processing won't work here. So you'll have to look at these options. So having those details lined out would have been really helpful for us. And I'm hoping that Shopify will improve its documentation to let other people know about this. Because, obviously we had a deadline. We were supposed to go live in August, and we went live in September because we had this roadblock of, it really impacted our site launch. It impacted, obviously, not just our e-commerce team, but it impacted our finance team that had to get involved to understand, okay, what are the transaction rates for PayPal Zettle versus the bank? Like, all of these departments within an organization are impacted if proper documentation and outlines aren't provided. So I hope that Shopify does make some improvements in this area, and that they become a little bit more informative. So
yeah, very cool. And by the way, I mean, Shopify is not the only company that would probably have this challenge, to be honest. I mean, I have worked with a lot of OEMs, and they all have similar challenge. There are going to be areas where you are going to be super well documented because that is being inquired a lot, that is being used a lot. That's how you, and documentation in my mind is actually part of your product. Okay, you have the same release cycle the way you are going to have for the product. It's just that people who are not really using it don't realize how important documentation of a product is going to be. So the follow-up question I'm going to have for you is going to be similar as well. Okay, so let's say if I'm the manufacturing executive, okay, I just don't understand what is documentation, why product documentation matters. If I am hiring a developer or the ERP guy or the e-commerce guy or the technical guy, they should be smart enough to figure this out. Why do you need documentation?
Why? Oh my gosh, why do you need documentation? It's like a recipe, right? Like, let's talk about it in cooking terms. Everybody that listens to your shows cooks, right? It's like, and let's even take it another level. Everyone on this show knows someone who got into baking sourdough during the pandemic, right? Making sourdough is not a straightforward thing. It's not like just throwing a bunch of things into a slow cooker and knowing that you're going to have a good chili at the end.
Right.
So you have to follow these directions to a T. The amount of water, what's the temperature in the room, like all of those details matter. So documentation, compare it to following that sourdough pandemic recipe that you're looking at. Like, it needs to be followed to a T.
Yeah.
And documentation basically provides you the keys to efficiency, and also provides the keys to staying within budget. So if there isn't proper documentation, it's just more time that your developer is spending trying to figure out what needs to happen, or how to make it work. And to just take it to another level, I mean, the most wonderful thing about the web, right, is that coding information is shared constantly, right? So, that is such a key piece to having proper documentation. Think about it as sharing is caring.
Exactly. So I am actually going to take this discussion in a different direction, and this is going to be more now from the developer perspective, because they also struggle. If you are going to have really good developer, they are really good at documentation. In fact, in my mind, they are almost like a marketer, to be honest. Okay, the way they write their documentation is going to be very different from a guy who's just an intern from a college, and they are simply trying to figure this out. So, and the other distinction that we typically have in the enterprise software world, as well as your system development world, where you are going to have programming languages that you are using off the shelf. So one of the terms that you had mentioned during your conversation was Ruby on Rails. Okay.
Yeah.
So now, if you actually talk to any of the developers or the IT guys, they don't really understand the importance of documentation. To be, in fact, they hate to do documentation. They really do hate to do documentation because this is just waste of time. You should be coding, right, as a developer. That's fun. Documentation is not fun. Okay. And this is what we see in engagement after engagement, that, okay, we are looking into an ERP implementation. They took 3 years to implement that. Now, nobody knows the business rules that are actually coded as part of the software. Now, this is a challenge in case of your enterprise software as well. It is somebody else's software. It is somebody else's car that I am trying to use. If I'm trying to build my own car that I built from scratch, that I know every single intricacy of that car, then it's going to be easy. So now, do you share similar experience when you are working with the enterprise software versus some sort of open source platform? Have you seen similar documentation challenges, that documentation is going to be far more important in case of your enterprise software? And that's why the quality of the publisher who's actually providing the software is going to be super important as well. Because if you are buying from somebody who's just a local shop, they might have developed the e-commerce software. Obviously, they are not going to have the best developers and not the best marketers for the internal documentation for the product. So obviously, it's going to be a challenge. Have you seen similar experiences when you are working on these engagements?
Yeah, absolutely. I work with a lot of agencies. So agencies often, they're handling the implementation or the development of a CMS, a content management system, or they've made a custom application of some sort that requires how-to documentations for the end user.
Yeah.
And most of the time it comes way late and it comes incomplete.
I know.
And you're like, okay, the only thing I've learned from this is how to create a user account.
Right,
I don't know how to do anything else.
Right.
So yeah, I think from an agency standpoint, it would be very important for agencies and to invest in, perhaps it's their head of product or product education that works alongside the developers, that goes through the experience from an end user perspective
Yep.
and handles the documentation, and then maybe works with alongside the developer on anything that might be missed. I do believe in a fair separation between what a developer is actually doing and some documentation. I do believe that developers' coding time is very precious, and there's a certain train of thought that most developers have to get into to actually get the job done. So my husband's actually a software engineer, so like maybe I'm a little biased, but I do believe in and having a little bit of a separation and having someone else experience the platform and aiding in that process of documentation, because end user versus the developer, two totally different experiences, right? So I think having an external person to work along the developer to create that documentation would be important. And then on your point about enterprise, I hate forums. I don't understand why these large enterprise companies are like, we'll have a help icon at the top of the site, and you click on the help icon and it's just forums, and you enter in your question, and all of a sudden you're like in a chain that you're just like, I still am not getting answers. Like ideally enterprise companies have taken the time to be like, what are the areas of our platform? And develop out the how-tos, and of course a forum can be included at the bottom so people can add in their comments and their rants and their workarounds, but I think it's another essential area for people to invest in. Clearly I'm passionate about this part, Sam, so
Yeah. I mean, you are living this life, right? And it could be very frustrating if you are not going to find the documentation and the answers, and things are not going to be in your control, because again, you are using somebody else's part. You just don't understand how it was designed, so somebody needs to explain that. And I completely agree with you that typically product companies, they are going to club the developer with somebody who can really act as the end user, as the proxy, because developers, I mean, if you actually pay attention to them, they don't really have training in marketing, and you do require a little bit of training in marketing, how to think from your customer's perspective. Okay. It sounds easy, but it's very hard to do. You require formal education and how to think like a customer, and that is the marketing education. And that's why you have the product experts that typically pair with your developers in the enterprise software company, because the documentation is as important as your product, if not more important. I feel it's more important. I don't care for the product as much. I care more for the documentation, to be honest. Okay, because that could actually fire back if they are going to be miscommunicating something and you are trying something else and then you push that code to production. Good luck with that. You are going to have a lot of fun.
Totally. And the other thing I was just thinking about is like, if your developer is doing the documentation, your developer is like the person that knows how to get out of, like, escape the room. You know what I mean? They know how to get from point A to point B. They're like the person that's played the video game 10 times and knows all the tricks and the turns, right? So you want to pair them with someone who has no idea, to be able to be like, discover those roadblocks and to help guide other people for how to use it. So
okay, love it. So we are going to go back to our Mexico story. Obviously, that's where the fun is, right? So, in these stories, so obviously one of the things that is going to be helpful for our listeners, in this particular case, we are talking about obviously the payment challenges that we have. And this is a new country. They have different regulations. They have different arrangements, the way they work. They have different cultural factors that are driving, how the payment is processed in that country. But overarchingly, let's say if I think more from the executive perspective, they typically don't worry about these things. So if we look at the business model, my assumption here is going to be that when you are in the fashion beauty space, this is probably going to be more of the B2C play. So, I don't think we have the enough business context from the business model perspective. If you could describe a little bit about, what kind of products are we talking about? What is the transaction, how they are being shipped? So you did mention that, this is the e-commerce plus the point of sale. So my assumption is going to be it's a very B2C play. But, do you want to describe the business a little bit more so that, we can build on the story?
Sure. So there is a warehouse for this particular client in Mexico.
Okay.
And so we had to set up a new integration for Shopify for e-commerce to the warehouse in Mexico, which also has an ERP. Unfortunately, the developers on the warehouse side haven't figured out to do inventory syncs. So meaning whenever inventory comes into the warehouse, a flat file needs to be uploaded to adjust inventory levels. Obviously, anytime an order is placed on the website, inventory is deducted from the website and also in the warehouse. So that piece is totally fine. It's just more for incoming products. To speak on the POS side, you actually touched on something interesting, which is cultural and financial differences, which is our receipts here in the United States are very different in comparison to what you find in Europe and what you find in Mexico as well. Right. So itemizing out that as an example is, a difference in business logic. So being able to support that as well, we had to figure that piece out, which we luckily have. So, but yeah, I mean, within the boutique, it's a beautiful store. Customers come in, they pick out their product. From an operational standpoint, what happens is a little bit clunkier than what happens here in the US, because the sales representative is ringing up the transaction both within Shopify POS, but then is also running the actual transaction in those separate terminals that I had mentioned that are provided by the bank. So, and then the customer, once the sales rep runs the transaction in the payment processor, they have to go back to Shopify and close out the transaction. So it's this they go from one system to another system and then back to the original system to close out that transaction. So it's like a little bit of a dance.
Yeah, dance in front of the customer. I love it.
Yeah, exactly. A little twirl and a curtsy.
Yeah. They must be getting tipped. I mean, I absolutely love it.
Exactly. It's like, wow, look at how much this person went through to give me a bag. It's true. Yeah, so I really hope that we can find a more seamless operational flow for them. Funny enough, since I originally met with you, Sam, I mentioned that we went with Stripe for payment processing. We've already decided we're going to change the payment processor again.
Okay.
So we're going to move from Stripe to Mercado Pago, and luckily have been introduced to someone at Mercado Pago. So now I have a sales representative that I'm speaking with that can work with us on transaction rates based off of the incoming sales volume that we're dealing with. So it's crazy. It's crazy.
It is always crazy, by the way. Doing any of these digital projects, they are never easy, irrespective of whether you are talking about integrating your POS with your commerce. And the dance that you are talking about, this dance, at least you can feel and experience and you can tip. There are a lot of dances that are happening in the background that you don't see, that people like you and me have to go through on a daily basis.
It's so true. It's so true.
Right. So, okay. So we are going to be touching on the complexity of the omni-channel. And it's not even completely omni-channel, to be honest. I mean, the way I am seeing this, because you have the POS, you have the e-commerce, everything is sitting inside Shopify. So still your life is going to be slightly easier because, at least your POS is connected with Shopify. If you're getting POS from somebody else, obviously it's going to be a nightmare to integrate both of them. Good luck with that. If you have that.
Exactly.
Right. So here, let's say, so the point I am trying to touch here is going to be, so you mentioned a little bit of dance. Okay. Why is the dance happening? My listeners will not be able to follow along. Sure. Why do you need to capture the transaction in the POS? And then why do you need to go to your e-commerce? And by the way, one other point that you mentioned related to inventory. Inventory is always the craziest part in any e-commerce, ERP implementation, because it's very, very, very hard to sync that. So in this particular case, I think, you mentioned that it was not syncing. So describe a little bit of, how inventory worked when you were going from your I don't know if they were in the US to Mexico warehouse to POS to your e-commerce, a lot of dance. So describe the dance.
Sure. So for your first portion of the question, which was in relation to why is there a dance in the store?
Exactly.
The reason why there's a dance in the store is Shopify POS does not offer payment processing for Mexico.
Okay.
So that's why these separate terminals provided by the bank are being used to actually run the credit card from a payment processing standpoint in the store. So that's what that is for your listeners. So that's why there's a dance. So the sales rep rings up the order in the store in POS. So that way there's inventory deduction on the store side. But then to be able to collect the payment, they're taking the credit card from the customer and ringing the credit card in these separate terminals that are run by the bank. And that's how we're collecting the money. And then the sales representative goes back into Shopify and then says, okay, I'm closing out this payment and payment has been collected. And so that's basically the reason for the dance there. So does that make sense?
It does.
Explained it clearly. Okay.
Yeah. So I am actually going to have a follow-up question, and then we can cover the inventory dance as well. I think we are going to be talking a lot about inventory, in this conversation. So here, let's say if I'm the sales rep, my goal is going to be that I can serve my customer as fast as possible. As a customer, what I want to do is, hey, I have given my credit card, just swipe it out, because that's going to be my expectation when I go to, let's say, Macy's, or if I go to any other stores. My expectation is that I give you my card, just process the payment, don't do dance in front of me, because I have 50 million things to worry about in my life. So that's going to be my take. So here I am expecting that you should be able to process the payment right away, but obviously because of the system limitations and the synchronization that is happening, there's a little bit of dance happening. Is there a way to fix this dance in the process? Let's say if they were willing to do this, and again, obviously in this particular case, there must be challenges from the business perspective that they may not want to fix it. So are there any approaches that might be able to fix the dance so that you don't have to do this?
Not right now until Shopify services Mexico with Shop Pay. There will always be a dance. So the only workaround that I can foresee is having sales representatives that are very good actors and seamless dancers. So it doesn't seem like, there's a dance going on in the background. So, which is definitely the case.
So this is going to be a skill addition for, salespeople, and now you need to pay them more because now you require acting as well with the sales skills.
Exactly. Yeah, there'll be union actors.
Right.
Oscar winning.
Right.
So.
Okay, so let's go back to our inventory dance, right? So one of the process that is happening here, I understand that the terminal is from somebody else, and you need to reconcile that transaction in your Shopify, because Shopify is the central system that is acting as the central system. You also mentioned that your warehouse inventory was not really in sync with your POS. You have the inventory in the POS. So describe the flow of the inventory, how the inventory is being synced. Is the inventory for the warehouse is maintained inside the Shopify as well? So you are doing the manual reconciliation right at the time of the transaction. So here you are actually closing out the order. So you have the actual inventory in your Shopify. Does Shopify ever going to send the inventory to POS as well? How does that process work?
Sure. So there's not an issue from an inventory standpoint as orders are coming in either on the e-commerce side or in the boutique. It's totally fine. So where the inventory issue lies right now is that whenever inventory comes from the United States or wherever the product is coming from, when it arrives to the warehouse, there isn't an integration on the side of the warehouse back to Shopify. Right. So how it's being managed right now is a flat file. So basically, let's say the warehouse receives a truck of 100 units. They basically take a spreadsheet and they import those extra 100 units that have been applied across product. Right. So when an order is actually taken place on the site or it happens within the store, there's X amount of inventory that's associated. And it's deducted anytime it's taken. There isn't, unfortunately, though, if there's returns or an item's not delivered and the product comes back to the warehouse, then those types of manual inventory adjustments are taking place right now instead of it being a one-to-one API conversation that should be happening.
Very interesting. So here, just to make sure I am able to follow along and my listeners are able to follow along. So obviously you have the warehouse in the back end sitting in Mexico. Anytime the products are going to be receiving the product, they are simply maintaining the count in a spreadsheet, and they are pushing in the Shopify. Shopify may have a warehouse named Mexico warehouse, and they must have all of these SKUs and the numbers that, okay, this is my inventory. And then, when the salesperson is actually trying to process the order inside Shopify, they are simply trying to deduct the inventory from that, but you have another inventory inside your store as well, right? So how does the sync work between the store and the Shopify main? Is there a sync process in that as well, or is it done automatically?
No, it's shared inventory. So, well, I mean, it's basically Shopify POS and Shopify. It's like the products are loaded.
Yeah.
And it's a shared product database, but you can see what e-commerce has versus what the boutique has.
Okay.
So it's shared. So what I will say is, the Mexico warehouse is also servicing B2B as well. So it has wholesale accounts and things of that nature. So we have multiple warehouses. And when I say multiple warehouses, that's not right. We have multiple stores is probably the right way to phrase it. So we split the inventory versus inventory for e-com and for POS, and then inventory for B2B. So that way no one's ever dipping each other's hands in each other's honey pots.
That's not fun enough. Come on. I mean, the stealing of the inventory is the most fun thing that you can do in a retail business.
It's so true. Oh my gosh. Back in my days at Bliss, we used to have such an issue with it. It was crazy. So, yeah.
Right? Okay, very interesting. So now let's talk about some of the payment issues, right? So obviously you mentioned that you have the B2B, you have the B2C, and payment is being processed somewhere else. So from the payment perspective, let's say if I'm doing this for the first time, I have all of these challenges in my business as well, where I have, let's say, an entity in Mexico, or it could be in Chile, or it could be in Pakistan, who knows? So you have all of these entities, and wherever you are trying to do business, I mean, obviously you have to have the storefront, because that's where your customers are, and you need to cater to them if you're a global business. And for global business, obviously it is going to be challenging. So do you have any sort of best practices when it comes to accepting the payment standards, accepting the e-commerce platform that you may be selecting? I know that payment is probably not going to be a priority for a lot of businesses when they are selecting, and let's say e-commerce or the ERP platform. They are going to think that, I'm just a retail business. As long as it does feel like my business, I'm probably going to select it. And then I'm going to be in trouble once I start processing my payment, because my processor is not there in that country.
Yeah, I absolutely. So I think if anybody's doing anything internationally, it is wise to both look at e-commerce platform, whatever platform you're going to use from e-com or POS, and then also understand your payment processing piece of it. So, and the best thing to do, honestly, in my opinion, is to obviously speak with the known payment processors that service that particular country. So and most of payment processors will list on their websites which countries they service. So that's like the best place to start. And then from an e-commerce platform or POS perspective, it's understanding which of those e-commerce systems or POS systems are commonly used actually in that country. So, I mean, in the case of the client that we've been discussing, it wasn't an option for us to use another e-com platform at this time, just because so much of their business in the US and in other countries is using Shopify. So it was like, we had a decision made for us. So we had to figure out the workarounds for all the other pieces. And sometimes that is what you have to do. But yes, I definitely recommend looking at both elements of it. Payment processing. Yeah. How are you going to get the money in the bank? That is the number one question everybody should be worried about at all times.
Of course. Amazing. So that's it for today. Do you have any last minute closing thoughts or remarks for our listeners?
I don't. This was absolutely lovely to talk with you, Sam. I really appreciate your passion towards this area of the business. So thank you.
And same here. And my personal takeaway from this conversation is going to be, irrespective of how small your software is going to be, whether you are simply buying a POS, whether you are buying e-commerce, as long as that actually touches your core enterprise architecture, which is going to be any of the transactions from the sales inventory, those typically have far greater impact on your business model, business processes. So you need to be slightly careful when you are going to be selecting that. On that note, I really want to thank you for your time. This has been a fascinating episode.
Thank you.
I cannot thank our guests enough for coming on the show, for sharing their knowledge and journey. I always pick up learnings from our guests, and hopefully you learned something new today. If you want to learn more about Jacquelyn or connect with her, head over to rebuildgirl.com. It's rebuildgirl.com and driver-digital.com. It's driver-digital.com, and view the samples of her work there. Links and more information will also be available in the show notes. If anything in this podcast resonated with you and your business, you might want to check other related episodes, including the interview with Chase Clymer, who brings a unique perspective for manufacturers and e-commerce merchants from his experience of helping customers getting their e-commerce businesses to grow from the ground up. Also, the interview with Jason Greenwood, who discusses the nuances of the click and collect process and why you need to centralize inventory and distribution strategy to enable this experience. Also, don't forget to subscribe and spread the word among folks with similar backgrounds. If you have any questions or comments about the show, please review and rate us on your favorite podcasting platform or DM me on any social channels. I'll try my best to respond personally and make sure you get help. Thank you, and I hope to catch you on the next episode of the WBS Podcast.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the WBS Podcast. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcasting platform so you never miss an episode. For more information on growth strategies for SMBs using ERP and digital transformation, check out our community at WBS.rocks. We'll see you next time.